a soft, beginning in a land of stone and smoke. You are lying in bed now. The world outside has grown quiet, the kind of quiet that lets memory rise like mist, soft and slow, without asking permission. Let me tell you a story tonight. Not one I lived, of course, but one I have carried for years. A story passed down in books with cracked spines, in whispers from old teachers, and in the quiet corners of museums where the air smells like dust and stone. It is the story of France. Not just the France of postcards and perfumes, but the deeper one. The France beneath the cobblestones. The France of tribes and torches of kings in cloaks and farmers with cracked hands. A land where revolutions echoed and cathedrals reached toward heaven. We will not rush. There is time. Tonight I will walk beside you through the shadows of its past. Just listen and let the world grow still. History does not always knock. Sometimes it just waits to be remembered. Tribes and toes in the river Gauls. Before Rome, I remember seeing a map, once faded brown around the edges, the kind they used to hang at the back of a classroom. It showed Europe, but not the Europe we know today. No straight borders, no nation-states, just land. And in the middle of that land, stretching across rivers and forests, was a word written in crooked letters: Gaul. France was not France yet, not even close. Back then it was a patchwork of tribes, fierce, proud, and as rooted in the land as the oak trees above them. They did not think of themselves as one people. They were the Parisi, the Arverni, the Sequani. Dozens of tribes, each with their own chieftains, their own sacred groves, their own ways of doing things. But they all shared something that ran deeper than borders, a life shaped by the rivers. The rivers were everything. They gave water-food trade. They carried gossip and gods. People bathed in them, fished in them, offered sacrifices to them. I once saw a documentary that showed a bronze helmet pulled from the bed of the Seine. It had been there for over 2,000 years, left behind by someone who believed the river was listening. The Gauls, as the Romans later called them, were a Celtic people. They wore their hair long and wild, painted their bodies for battle, and spoke a language that has long since faded from the world. Their warriors carried swords that bent on impact and had to be straightened underfoot mid-fight. Brutal, yes, but imaginative. Their homes were clusters of huts, often on hilltops for defense. They built oppida, early fortified settlements with wooden walls and dirt roads. Inside, people tended goats, brewed thick, cloudy beer, and stored grain in large pits underground. Children ran barefoot. Dogs wandered freely. And the nights were filled with the smells of wood smoke, wet leaves, and stew. But they were not savages, no matter what later writers claimed. They had artists, jewelers, metalworkers. They made torques, neck rings of twisted gold and silver, worn not just for beauty, but for honor. They told stories by firelight, stories of thunder gods and warrior queens. They held assemblies. Some tribes elected their leaders. Others passed power through family lines. It was not chaos. It was a different kind of order. And they had druids. No one knows exactly what druids did, but everyone agrees they mattered. They were priests, judges, healers, historians. They remembered things so others would not have to write them down. The Romans feared them, which is usually a sign of respect in a twisted sort of way. The Gauls worshipped in forests. They believed the sacred lived in nature, in the rustle of trees, the curve of a stream, the cry of a hawk. Some trees were never to be cut. Some stones were never to be moved. And when they buried their dead, they often left offerings, food tools, even entire chariots, as if the journey beyond needed wheels. But life was not peaceful. These tribes fought sometimes over land, sometimes over pride, often over nothing at all. Blood feuds could last generations. One tribe might raid another over cattle, and it would turn into a grudge that lasted a century. They were brave, but also stubborn. Courage was currency, and stories of a great battle often mattered more than the reasons for it. Still, they knew trade. They bartered salt furs, amber, even slaves. Coins began to appear, some from Greece, others made locally, with strange animals stamped on them. Wine arrived in clay jars from Italy, and with it came ideas, rumors, and an awareness that something larger was coming. And it was. By the time Julius Caesar set his eyes on Gaul in the 1st century, before Christ, the tribes were already changing. Some had alliances with Rome, others hated it. But they were not ready, not really, for the machine that was the Roman army. Not ready for legions that moved like clockwork, built roads as they marched and wrote everything down. The story of Gaul under Roman rule is the story of how a wild, beautiful mosaic was slowly paved over with stone. But we are not there yet. Tonight I want to linger just a bit longer here before the eagle banners, before the Latin, before the cities were carved into the hills. I like to imagine that if you had walked through a Gallic forest, then you would have heard music. Maybe a reed flute, maybe the beat of a drum made from stretched hide. You would have seen smoke rising from fires and faces painted with lines of ash and berry juice, and someone, probably an old man with wild hair and a voice like gravel, would have been telling a story to a group of children. A story about how the rivers were gods. A story about how the world began. A story that no one ever wrote down. The Roman years, roads, wine, and empire. I once stood in the ruins of an old Roman amphitheater in southern France, stone benches, worn smooth by centuries of wind, footsteps, and silence. A stray cat wandered across the stage as if it still remembered where the lions used to wait. It reminded me how deep the Roman footprint went, even in places that no longer said their name aloud. When Caesar came to Gaul, he did not come gently. The year was 58 before Christ. He wrote about it himself, his own version, of course. 9 years of war. Hundreds of thousands killed, cities burned, rivers red. He called it conquest. The tribes called it something else. But the Romans did more than conquer. They built. They brought roads first, straight lines across hills and forests paved with flat stones, edged with ditches. You can still walk some of them today, though now they are framed by vineyards instead of legions. The roads connected Gaul to Rome and Rome to the rest of the known world. Trade, taxes, troops all moved faster now. Then came the cities. Lugdunum, which became Lyon. Lutetia, which became Paris. Massilia, already Greek, became more Roman with each passing year. The cities had walls, baths, aqueducts, theaters, temples. They had order, a Roman kind of order, with squares and laws and Latin graffiti scratched into brick walls. People adapted, some quickly. Gallic chieftains who resisted Rome found themselves dead or exiled. Others who cooperated found themselves draped in togas and sipping wine from Italian clay. Their children learned Latin. Their daughters wore Roman brooches. The old gods were not forgotten, but Jupiter's name began to echo louder. It was not just architecture and language. Rome brought systems, census counts, tax collectors, a calendar, measurements. The idea that citizenship could be earned, not just inherited. Some Gauls became Roman senators. Others joined the Roman army and fought in distant lands wearing helmets shaped by a city they had never seen. And yet deep down, the land remembered. In the countryside, far from the cities, Gallic customs lingered. People still gathered for seasonal festivals. Offerings were still left by sacred springs. The Romans built temples, yes, but often on top of older sites, as if they too could feel something ancient pulsing beneath the stone. I once read a letter from a Roman merchant, complaining that his Gaulish neighbors sang too loudly at night. Said their music was wild and unsettling. I smiled when I read that, because that meant it survived. The sound, the rhythm, the thing that came before Rome, it was still there, just muffled by columns and stone. The Roman Peace Pax Romana lasted for centuries. Trade flourished, roads grew crowded, amphitheaters filled with cheers and gasps. A Gallic farmer could harvest grain, sell it in the city, pay his taxes, and return home under Roman protection. For many, life improved. For others, it became smaller, predictable, watched. Rome also brought writing. And through that, we learned what the Romans thought of Gaul sometimes, admiration, often condescension. They called the Gauls brave but wild, noble but backwards. It was an empire's way of saying, you are welcome here, as long as you become more like us. And still, Gaul endured. It became a Roman province, yes, but it also became something else. A blend, a hybrid. Latin spoken with Celtic rhythms, gods with double names, buildings with Gallic curves. It was not erasure, it was something more subtle, a layering. But even the strongest stones crack. By the 3rd century, the empire had begun to tremble, pressure from the outside, corruption from the inside, armies stretched too thin, emperors murdered before their statues could be finished. In Gaul, signs of unraveling began to show. Forts reinforced, trade disrupted, taxes raised, a sense that Rome might not last forever, an idea once unthinkable. And then came the 5th century. The Rhine froze one winter. I remember reading that in a book and pausing because something about it felt final. The river froze, and Germanic tribes walked across it into Roman lands. Among them were the Franks. But that is for another part of our story. Tonight, let us leave the world of marble and march. Let us step away from the amphitheaters and the aqueducts. The firelight is dimming. The cat is gone now. And all that remains is stone and wind and the memory of sandals on cobblestones, the fall and the Franks. Out of the ashes. I once saw a coin green with age found in the soil, near what used to be Lutetia. On one side, a Roman emperor with a cracked crown. On the other, a strange mark, less Roman, more crude, almost like it was made in a hurry. That coin had lived through something, and by the look of it, that something was the end. Rome did not fall all at once. It fell the way old trees do, slowly from the inside, until one day, the wind finishes the job. In Gaul, that wind came in the form of the Franks. The 5th century was a time of collapse. Roads that once echoed with the sound of marching legions grew quiet. Taxes stopped arriving in Rome. Cities shrank. The Roman legions pulled back first to defend Italy, then to survive it all. And the tribes, those names that once filled Caesar's war journals, began to rise again, but different this time. Changed. Watching. The Franks were not new to Gaul. They had been skirting its northern edges for generations, testing borders, trading, raiding. They were Germanic, fierce, and increasingly organized. And when Rome's grip slipped, they did not wait for permission. They walked in. There was no great conquest, no grand declaration, just a slow, steady settling. Villages claimed, towns occupied, Roman villas repurposed, temples turned into churches or barns or left to crumble. The old order did not vanish. It decayed, piece by piece, until it was more memory than law. And in that space, a leader emerged. His name was Clovis, young, bold, and ruthless when he needed to be. He came from the Merovingian line, a Frankish family that knew how to fight and how to wait. Clovis united the Franks, not an easy task, since tribal loyalties ran deep, and began expanding his reach. By the time he was done, Gaul, as Rome had known, it was gone. In its place stood the seeds of something new. But it was not just his sword that made him powerful. It was his baptism. According to legend and stories from this time often drift between fact and faith, Clovis converted to Christianity after a desperate battlefield prayer. His wife was already a believer, and she had pleaded with him to turn to her God. When he won, he did, and with that single act, he changed everything. You see, most Germanic tribes who had entered former Roman lands had adopted a form of Christianity considered heretical by the Catholic Church. But Clovis chose Catholicism, the same form practiced in Rome itself. That decision aligned him not just with heaven, but with the old Roman elites, the bishops, and the people who still held pieces of influence in the crumbling empire. His baptism was not just spiritual, it was strategic. It gave him legitimacy, it gave him allies, and it gave France its first real king, not a warlord, not a chieftain, but a monarch anointed by both sword and sacrament. The Merovingian dynasty would go on to rule for nearly 2 centuries. Their kings wore their hair long as a symbol of divine power. They issued laws that blended Roman custom with Frankish tradition. They patronized churches, built monasteries, and tried in their own rough way to bring some order to a land that still remembered roads and statues. But things were never quite the same. The cities never fully recovered. The roads broke apart. Literacy faded outside the monasteries. Trade slowed, and yet in the shadows of former Roman greatness, something stubborn kept flickering. Faith. Churches became centers of life. Monks copied ancient texts by candlelight. Cathedrals rose slowly, stone by stone. People began marking time, not by emperors or battles, but by saints' days and holy festivals. The Roman world may have died, but its soul was being repainted in stained glass and sung in Latin hymns. I remember once reading a line in a dusty old book: Gaul became France, not with a sword, but with a prayer. That may be too poetic, but it is not entirely wrong. The land was still the same: forests, rivers, hills. The people were still proud, still tied to their soil. But now they were starting to see themselves differently. Not just as tribes, not just as former subjects of Rome, but as something new. The word France had not yet arrived, but the Franks were here, and they were not leaving. That little coin I mentioned earlier, the one with the emperor on one side and the scratchy mark on the other. Historians think that mark was the beginning of a new mint, a new ruler, a new age trying to stamp itself onto the bones of the old. And in many ways, that is what this time was: a long, uncertain breath between empires, a moment where the world held its breath and waited to see what would grow from the rubble. France, it turns out, was beginning to take shape, quietly, carefully, in the shadow of ruins and the echo of prayers. Charlemagne and the birth of a dream. I saw his name carved in marble once high on a wall inside a church older than anyone alive today. Charlemagne. It stood there like it had always belonged, like the letters themselves carried weight. And in some ways they did. He was not just a king. He was the idea of a king, tall in memory, even taller in legend. Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, was not born into a quiet world. The Merovingians had faded into history, their long-haired kings, more symbolic than strong. In their place came the Carolingians, a family of warriors and administrators. Charlemagne's father, Pepin the Short, was the first to be anointed king by the Pope, a sign that divine approval now came in ink and oil, not just blood. When Pepin died in 768, his sons inherited the kingdom. Charlemagne ended up with it all. He took a fragmented, war-prone land and turned it into something closer to a vision, not just a kingdom, but an empire. He ruled not only the Franks, but eventually most of Western Europe, what is now France, Germany, the Low Countries, northern Italy, and more. And he ruled not just with the sword, though he had one, and knew how to use it. He ruled with structure, with law, with the dream of unity. He fought wars, yes, against the Lombards in Italy, against the Saxons in the east. He forced conversions, burned pagan groves, and planted crosses where once stood totems. He was fierce and sometimes brutal, but he also built schools. That part always caught my attention. In a time when most rulers were content with conquest, Charlemagne wanted people to read. He invited scholars from across Europe, encouraged the copying of texts, preserved Latin literature that might have vanished into ash. Monasteries became centers of learning. A man named Alcuin from England helped him standardize education. They even created a new handwriting style, clear, legible, so that ideas could travel across time. His court at Aachen was not just a seat of power. It was a workshop of civilization. In the year 800 on Christmas Day, Charlemagne knelt in prayer at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Pope Leo III placed a crown upon his head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. It was meant to be symbolic, but the symbol hit hard. The Roman Empire, long thought dead, had just been reborn in the shape of a Frankish king. He was surprised, they said. Maybe. Maybe not. Either way, it sent a message that power in Europe now rested not in the fading ruins of the old empire, but in the north. In a man who could read, who could fight, who could pray, and who could govern. Of course, no empire lasts forever. When Charlemagne died in 814, the empire passed to his son, Louis the Pious. And from there, to grandsons who did what grandsons sometimes do. They argued, they divided, they weakened the foundation. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 split the empire into 3 parts, setting the stage for the future nations of France and Germany. Still, the idea lingered. Even centuries later, kings and emperors would trace their authority back to Charlemagne. His name would be invoked in wars, in treaties, in dreams, and not just in France. The Holy Roman Empire, which lasted until 1806, claimed descent from his crown. But for France, he was something more personal. He was the first ruler who imagined the land as more than just property. He imagined it as a people, a culture, a place that could be educated, governed, united. That dream would fade, of course, as centuries of feudalism crept in. But the embers stayed warm. I like to think about him riding through the forests of Gaul, not just as a conqueror, but as a man who could see what others could not, who looked at a scattered world and imagined a map. Not a perfect one, not even a lasting one, but a map with lines drawn not just in soil, but in hope. There are statues of him across Europe, some on horseback, some in robes, but none, I think, capture the quiet ambition that sat behind his eyes. That belief that order could be born from chaos, and that a teacher's pen might one day carry as much weight as a general's sword. And maybe he was right. Castles, crosses, and chaos. The feudal age. I once visited a castle in the French countryside, one of those perched high on a hill, with thick stone walls and a moat dry for centuries. It was quiet that day, the kind of quiet that makes your footsteps sound louder than they should. As I stood under the shadow of its crumbling tower, I thought about what it must have been like when those walls were not ruins, but refuge. After Charlemagne, the great vision of unity began to crumble, not all at once, but like threads pulled slowly from a tapestry. His grandsons split the empire. Local lords gained more power, and the dream of one France gave way to hundreds of little Frances each, with its own laws, loyalties, and ambitions. Feudalism was not a system someone designed. It was a patch, a survival instinct. In a world where central authority faded, people turned to whoever could protect them. Kings were distant, but the lord in the stone house up the hill, he had armed men, a storehouse of grain, and walls thick enough to outlast a siege. So people swore loyalty. They became vassals. They worked the land. In return, they were given safety or something like it. It was a hard life. The fields were unforgiving, the winters long. Most peasants never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. They woke with the sun broke their backs for grain, and prayed that disease, war, or taxes would not take more than they could spare. They were free in name, but bound in practice, bound to the land, bound to the seasons, bound to their place in a world that rarely looked back at them. Above them were the nobles' counts, dukes, barons, men who built castles, trained knights, and fought over rivers and titles. Their lives were more comfortable, but rarely peaceful. Feudal lords spent as much time battling each other as they did governing. Alliances were made and broken like bread. A wedding might mean 10 years of calm. An insult might spark 10 years of fire. And then there was the church. The church stood like a spine through all of it. The village priest, the bishop in the nearby city, the abbots in monasteries carved from stone. In a world of chaos, the church offered structure, rules, rituals, forgiveness. It owned land. It collected tithes. It promised heaven in exchange for obedience. For many, it was the only place that seemed eternal. But it also brought beauty. Even in the most brutal times, people built cathedrals, not for comfort, but for awe. Towering stone arches, stained glass, that caught the morning sun choirs, that sang Latin hymns into cold air. You can still feel that echo when you step inside, the cold on your skin, the hush that falls over your shoulders, the sense that something older than you is watching, listening. Knights came from this world, mounted warriors, sworn to protect their lord, trained from boyhood to fight, to serve, and to follow a code. At least that was the theory. In practice, many knights were little more than armed thugs with family crests. But some believed. Some held to ideals of chivalry, of honor, of protecting the weak. I once read an old story, a romance written in the 12th century, about a knight who spent a year fighting dragons and bandits, only to come home and plant flowers for a widow. Probably fiction, but the fact that someone wrote it tells you what people wished for even then. France during the feudal age was a land of layers, layered power, layered faith, layered fear. Kings still existed, but their power was symbolic more than sovereign. It would take centuries before the French crown meant control over the entire land. For now, the king ruled Paris, and Paris ruled little else. The real power was scattered like seeds in the wind, lodged in stone towers, passed through bloodlines, and defended with blades. And yet, in the middle of that chaos, culture bloomed. Poetry written in the Languedoc and Languedoc spread from court to court. Troubadours sang songs of lost love and distant battles. Monks illuminated manuscripts with gold leaf and careful hands. Farmers, despite everything, bred better wheat. Builders, despite the wars, raised taller spires. Mothers, despite the grief, told stories by firelight that still live in folktales today. It was not a golden age, but it was not a dark one either. It was something in between. A time of survival, yes, but also of slow growth. Like ivy on a wall inching upward, even while the stones cracked and shifted. The castle I stood in that day had been abandoned for centuries. Grass grew in the courtyard. A hawk circled overhead. But when I leaned against one of the cold stones, I could feel the weight of it, not just the weight of rock, but of history of lives lived inside of voices long gone, of footsteps echoing in hallways, now filled with silence. France in this age was not yet a nation, but it was becoming something. Through toil, through prayer, through stubborn everyday hope, a patchwork slowly stitching itself into a story. Kings and crusades, faith and fire. There is a church in Versailles, perched on a quiet hill, with arches worn smooth by 1,000 years of footsteps. I remember the guide saying that Bernard of Clairvaux once preached there, calling men to join the crusade. And I stood there looking up at the same ceiling, wondering how many actually returned. The Middle Ages were not still. For all their stone and silence, they moved with storms beneath. And in France, that storm was faith. The church did not just hold power, it was power. It crowned kings owned land, wrote laws, defined morality. Priests were everywhere. Monks ran the schools. Bishops sat on councils. If a king wished to be seen as legitimate, he needed not just a sword, but a blessing. But blessings came with strings. By the 11th century, reformers within the church were trying to pull it back from corruption, against simony, against priestly marriage, against nobles appointing bishops, as if they were household staff. This tension simmered even as the church expanded, and it was within this tension that the Crusades were born. It began in 1095, when Pope Urban II, speaking to a crowd in Clermont, urged Christians to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. He promised absolution, glory, purpose. France especially answered the call. Knights sold land. Peasants followed carts. Crosses were stitched into tunics. It is easy to forget now beneath the weight of history, but for many, it felt like a mission of the soul. The First Crusade, brutal as it was, succeeded. Jerusalem was taken in 1099, and Europe exhaled. But the fire had caught. More crusades followed, some better planned than others. French nobles played key roles, Louis VII in the Second Crusade, and later Richard the Lionheart of England, though half his heart was French. The French crown tied itself to this holy cause, even as it struggled to control its own backyard. Because while men marched east, trouble brewed at home. The Capetian dynasty descendants of Hugh Capet had taken the throne in 987. But their power was thin, like butter scraped across too much bread. They ruled Paris and its nearby lands, the Île-de-France, but beyond that real power lay with dukes and counts. The Duke of Normandy, for instance, held more land than the king, and across the Channel he was a king himself after 1066. So, French kings had to be clever, patient. They forged marriages, bought land, planted symbols. They used the church as an ally, painting themselves as defenders of the faith. Cathedrals were commissioned: Chartres, Reims, Notre Dame, each one both a house of worship and a monument to authority. And all the while, the idea of France kept growing. Not quickly, not neatly, but steadily. The Crusades helped in strange ways. They distracted overmighty nobles. They poured energy outward. They connected France to the Mediterranean to trade to new ideas. And they reminded peasants who their king was, because when the cross was raised, it was the king's banner that flew beneath it. But the Crusades were also cruel. Towns were razed. Jews were massacred in Europe before the armies even reached the Holy Land. The Fourth Crusade meant to strike Egypt, instead sacked Constantinople, a Christian city. And by the time the so-called Children's Crusade set out, thousands of young people walk in toward the sea, many never seen. Again, the glory had rotted through. Back in France, power was shifting. The king slowly was becoming more than just a name. Louis XVI, Louis XVI, Philip Augustus. Each added weight to the crown. Philip especially began the long process of wresting Normandy back from the English. He was not always liked, but he was respected. He built bureaucracy. He expanded justice. He planted flags. The church watched all of this with both pride and unease. Kings who once knelt now negotiated. Bishops who once ruled in splendor found themselves taxed. It was a delicate dance and one not always performed with grace. But what I find most moving about this period is not the battles or the politics. It is the faith of ordinary people. The woman who lit a candle in Chartres for her son at war. The man who carved angels into stone for a cathedral he would never see finished. The pilgrim who walked from Le Puy to Santiago with a pebble in his shoe and a prayer on his lips. None of them ruled, none of them wrote laws, but their lives built the soul of France. I remember hearing a bell ring once early morning in a small town south of Dijon. It was the only sound in the valley. For a moment, time felt thin, as if I could reach through it and touch someone who had heard that same sound in the 12th century, standing barefoot on cold stone, whispering the same words. In that way, faith was the thread. It bound king to peasant war, to worship glory to grief. France in this age was not yet fully formed, but it had rhythm. It had direction. And in every toll of the bell, every torch lifted to stained glass, it was remembering itself, slowly, fiercely, with both sword and song. 100 years of pain. England and the Crown. I remember walking through a small town in Normandy, where the stones felt older than time, and the walls still bore the soft scars of forgotten battles. Someone once told me that if you dig deep enough in any French field, you are likely to find something: an arrowhead, a coin, or a bone. That is what centuries of war will do, and none lasted longer or hurt more deeply than the 100 Years' War. It did not begin as a war. It began as a claim. In 1328, the French king died without a male heir. Edward III of England, whose mother was a French princess, believed he had a rightful claim to the French crown. The French nobility disagreed. They chose Philip VI, a cousin of the deceased king. Lines were drawn, oaths were tested, and soon enough, arrows flew. What followed was not one war, but many fought over generations across muddy fields and scorched villages, with years of silence between bursts of fire. It was not always continuous, but it was always waiting like a storm just beyond the hills. The early years belonged to England, at Crécy in 1346, and again at Poitiers in 1356. English longbows tore through French knights like parchment. Armor meant nothing against speed and skill. French nobility fell in droves, and with them, the illusion of invincibility. But war was not the only enemy. In 1347, the Black Death arrived. It swept through France with a fury no army could match. Fields went unplowed. Families vanished. 1/3 of the population died. Churches rang funeral bells until the ropes wore thin. And yet the war continued. France fractured. There were uprisings like the Jacquerie, where peasants worn thin by taxes, and loss rose up in desperation. They were crushed brutally. Paris itself, once a jewel, became a place of whispers and watchmen. The English occupied swaths of land in the north. The French king was captured. Morale sank, and then came something unexpected: a girl. In 1429, Joan of Arc arrived at the court of Charles VII. She was young. She could not read, but she claimed to hear the voice of God, and she spoke with a conviction that cut through despair. Dressed in armor, riding a white horse, she led the French to lift the siege of Orléans, a victory that stunned the world. She believed France could be saved, and for a time it was. Charles was crowned at Reims, the traditional site of French kingship. It was symbolic. It mattered. Joan had given France not just a win, but a story, a reason to hope. But stories can be dangerous. In 1430, Joan was captured by allies of the English. She was put on trial for heresy, accused of witchcraft, and burned at the stake in Rouen. She was 19. They tried to erase her. Instead, they made her immortal. The war dragged on for another 2 decades, but France had begun to turn the tide. Better leadership, stronger finances, a growing sense of unity. These things, slow and uneven, began to push the English back. By 1453, the war was over. Almost all English holdings in France were lost, save Calais. The dream of an English crown in Paris faded into smoke, but the scars remained. Entire regions lay in ruin. Generations of men had died before ever knowing peace. The economy was battered, the nobility thinned, and yet something had changed. The French monarchy, once weak, had hardened in the fire. It had survived. It had learned. And for the first time in centuries, people began to speak of France not just as a place, but as a nation. The crown had passed through chaos and come out the other side, with more than a head to wear it. It had a purpose, a legacy, a people behind it. I once read a poem carved into a wooden beam in a rebuilt village church. It said simply, "We were ashes, but now we kneel together." That is what the 100 Years' War did. It burned. But in the burning, it cleared the way for something new. For a country that remembered what it felt like to almost disappear and decided not to. Rebirth and Renaissance. A quieter bloom. I remember standing in the cloister of a monastery in the Loire Valley, where vines curled around stone columns, and the air smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. It was quiet there, peaceful, in a way that made you feel like time had slowed down, or maybe just stepped outside for a moment. That quiet, I think, is what France had been waiting for. After the 100 Years' War, France did not roar back to life. It exhaled. The land had been ravaged, cities burned, families shattered. But like a field left fallow, it began to heal, not quickly, not completely, but steadily. And in that healing, something delicate took root: the Renaissance. It did not arrive all at once, and it did not begin in France. Italy had sparked the flame: Leonardo, Michelangelo, Florence, Venice. But the winds carried it north, and the French, weary of war and hungry for meaning, opened their windows to let the light in. Kings now played a new role, not just warriors, but patrons. Charles VIII marched into Italy in 1494 and brought back more than soldiers. He brought books, artists, architects. His successor, Louis XIII, married into the Milanese nobility and continued the exchange. But it was under Francis I that the French Renaissance truly blossomed. Francis was the kind of king who loved ideas as much as power. He invited Leonardo da Vinci to live at his court, and the old master brought with him not only the Mona Lisa, but notebooks filled with machines, musings, and dreams. Francis built libraries, encouraged humanist scholars, and commissioned chateaux that still rise above the rivers like something out of a painting. The Loire Valley became the cradle of refinement. Architecture lightened, gardens stretched wide. Poetry was written not in Latin, but in French. The language itself began to shift from the rough patchwork of regional dialects towards something closer to a national tongue. But this was not just about nobility. In towns and cities, merchants grew richer. Guilds trained craftsmen. Printing presses spread ideas faster than the church could contain them. People began reading more Bibles, romances, treatises, satires. Some questioned old truths. Others found new beauty in the ancient world, reimagined through modern eyes. Art, too, took on a new tone. It was less about judgment, more about wonder. Painters explored light and shadow. Sculptors captured softness in stone. Music, once written only for worship, now danced in courts and echoed through festivals. Even clothing changed. The stiff chainmail and somber wool of war gave way to velvet lace color. People dressed to be seen, not just protected. I remember once seeing a portrait of a noblewoman from that era, hair coiled like a seashell eye's steady lips, slightly amused. She looked like someone who knew the world had changed and that she was ready for it. But the Renaissance was not without tension. France was still ruled by kings. Peasants still toiled. Inequality remained tucked beneath the surface, and the church, though still powerful, began to feel the tremors of something coming. Across the border, Martin Luther had nailed his theses to a church door in Wittenberg, and the ideas were traveling fast. Still, for a time, there was balance. France in the early 1500s felt like a country catching its breath. The wars had quieted. The soil had steadied. The people, though wary, began to lift their heads, and in that lift, they saw stars. I remember hearing a historian once say that the Renaissance in France was a whisper, not a shout. I think that is right. It was not sudden. It did not overthrow anything. But it reminded people that life could be more than survival, that there was space for grace. In the cloister that day, I saw a monk watering roses. He was bent with age, moving slowly, but with purpose. Around him, the silence was full, not empty, full of books and prayers and soft footsteps on old stone. That, to me, is the image of France during the Renaissance, not a blaze, but a bloom, quiet, patient, and deeply beautifully alive. Fire in the Pulpit Reformation and religious wars. There was a Sunday morning years ago when I wandered into a small Protestant chapel hidden behind ivy-covered walls in southern France. The pews were wooden and creaked under the weight of memory. An elderly man sweeping the floor told me his family had prayed there for generations, quietly, cautiously, sometimes in secret. That caution had roots, he said, deep ones, roots that reached back to a time when faith could get you killed. That time was the 16th century. The Renaissance may have opened France's windows to beauty and reason, but it also cracked the door to revolution. And into that crack, a storm blew through. It began as storms often do, far from Paris. In 1517, across the Rhine, Martin Luther challenged the authority of the Catholic Church. He called out its indulgences, questioned its priests, and dared to put Scripture into the hands of ordinary people. His words spread like wildfire, fueled by printing presses, fueled by anger. And before long, the flames reached France. At first, it was just murmurs. A few students whispering at the University of Paris. A pamphlet found under a church bench. A sermon that leaned just a little too far. But the church heard it, and the king did too. France was Catholic. Deeply so. The Pope's voice still echoed in its cathedrals. But faith was no longer just a matter of ritual. It was becoming personal and dangerous. The people who embraced the new ideas, Scripture over tradition, faith over works, came to be called Huguenots. They were Protestants in a Catholic land. Some were nobles looking to challenge royal power. Others were artisans, merchants, ordinary folk drawn to a religion that promised a direct line to God. And the state, it saw heresy. It saw division. It saw rebellion. By the 1540s, the burnings had begun. The repression grew sharper. Edicts were passed. Pastors were hunted. But still the movement spread. Geneva, just across the border, became a haven for exiles and a beacon of reform, thanks in part to John Calvin, whose teachings added fuel to the fire in France. What followed was almost inevitable. From 1562 to 1598, France tore itself apart in a series of brutal conflicts known as the Wars of Religion. They were not just about belief. They were about power territory, old grudges, and new ambitions. But faith lit the match. There were 8 wars in total. 8. Noble families chose sides. Armies marched under banners not just of kings, but of God. Villages were burned. Churches were desecrated. Friends turned against each other. And in 1572, the worst came to pass. On the night of St. Bartholomew's Day, thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered in Paris and across the country. It began with the assassination of Protestant leaders, gathered for a royal wedding. But it spiraled. Doors were kicked in. Children were dragged from hiding. The Seine ran red. No one knows exactly how many died. Some say $3,000, others say $10,000. But everyone remembers it. And yet somehow France did not collapse. In 1589, a Protestant noble named Henry of Navarre rose to the throne. He was clever, charismatic, practical. To become king, he converted to Catholicism, famously saying, "Paris is worth a mass." But he did not forget his roots. In 1598, Henry IV issued the Edict of Nantes, granting limited religious freedom to Protestants. It was not perfect. It did not heal everything. But it was a start. The wars ended. The fires cooled, and France once again began to rebuild. I think of that old man in the chapel often. His family's prayers, whispered through centuries of fear, are part of this story. As are the cracked stones of cathedrals, the faded ink of forbidden Bibles, and the silence that followed the gunfire. The Reformation in France was not just a theological debate. It was a reckoning. A time when belief became a battlefield. And though it scarred the nation, it also deepened it, forcing France to look inward, to ask who it was and who it could be. That chapel tucked behind the ivy still stands, quiet now, but you can feel it if you sit long enough. The weight of faith, the cost of conscience, and the hope that someday people could pray without fear. The Sun King's long shadow. Absolutism and Versailles. I once stood at the gates of Versailles on a gray spring morning. The sky was overcast, the gold leaf on the palace gates gleaming in defiance of the weather. I remember thinking, this is not a building. This is a message. A message from a man who wanted the world to know exactly who ruled France and how completely. That man was Louis XIV. He was 5 years old when he became king, too young to remember the Fronde, the noble uprisings that had shaken the country in his childhood. But he remembered the fear, the chaos, the way power slipped when shared. So when he came of age, he made a decision. There would be no more rivals, no more divided rule. France would revolve around him and him alone. They called him the Sun King, not just because he loved theater and symbolism, but because he believed truly that he was the center of France's universe. Every law, every coin, every sword and sermon reflected his will. He ruled for 72 years, longer than any other French monarch. And in that time, he reshaped the country like a sculptor working in marble. He built Versailles not just as a home, but as a tool, a trap really, He invited the nobles to live there away from their own lands and armies. He dazzled them with gold, with fountains, with endless ceremony. He turned politics into performance. If you wanted power, you had to attend the king's rising. You had to bow at precisely the right angle. You had to dance. Meanwhile, real power, taxation, justice, military command was centralized in Paris in ministries loyal to Louis alone. The old feudal order was finished. France was no longer a quilt of semi-independent regions. It was a state with one mind, one voice, and one crown. But absolutism came at a cost. Louis waged war almost constantly against the Dutch, the Spanish, the Austrians. His armies were large, his ambitions larger. He expanded French territory, yes, but he drained the treasury. Entire generations of men marched off to fight for the king's glory, and many did not return. At home, he pushed for religious unity. In 1685, he revoked the Edict of Nantes. Protestant churches were destroyed, families fled. Some converted to survive. Others smuggled Bibles in the hems of their clothes. France lost thousands of its most skilled workers, artisans, merchants, thinkers, all in the name of Catholic uniformity. And yet, there was grandeur. This was the age of Molière, of Racine, of Lully. French became the language of diplomacy, of fashion, of philosophy. The arts flourished. Science took root. The Academy of Sciences was born. Observatories built. The world was being mapped, measured, understood, and France wanted to be at the center of it. I once read that during Louis's reign, France became a mirror. To its allies, it reflected glory. To its enemies, intimidation. But to its own people, it reflected inequality. While nobles danced at Versailles, peasants struggled under heavy taxes. The countryside whispered of hunger. And the belief that the king was chosen by God, divine right, they called it, began to wear thin. Still, the machine held. Louis XIV died in 1715. He had outlived his sons, his grandson, even his mistresses. He left behind a grandson, a weakened economy, and a nation, both awed and exhausted. Versailles still stands a glittering fossil of absolute power. And when you walk its endless halls, you can almost hear it, the rustle of silk, the echo of violins, the quiet footsteps of courtiers, measuring every move. But listen closer, and you might hear something else. The murmurs in the countryside, the questioning in cafes, the shift in the air, because even the longest shadows fade. And as the 18th century dawned, France was beginning to ask, what if the sun set? What then? In whispers in the salons. Enlightenment and the seeds of revolution. There was a night years ago when I found myself in a quiet Parisian cafe, the kind with scratched wooden tables and little lamps that flicker like old ideas refusing to die. A group of students nearby were debating Rousseau. They were loud, idealistic, full of wine and certainty. And I remember smiling because that passion, that questioning, that fire, it was not new. It had lit Paris long before them. Back in the 18th century, that fire began to spread in earnest. It started in salons, those glittering living rooms where the well-read gathered to talk about everything from science to satire. Hosted mostly by brilliant women like Madame Geoffrin or Madame de Staël, these gatherings became the heartbeat of the Enlightenment in France. Ideas flowed like wine: liberty, equality, reason, tolerance. No crown, no altar, no ancient tradition was safe from scrutiny. Voltaire mocked kings and priests with wit sharp enough to draw blood. Rousseau imagined a world where man was born free, but everywhere in chains. Diderot compiled a radical thing called an encyclopedia, not just a book of facts, but a manifesto of thought, trying to catalog all human knowledge and make it accessible to everyone. And Montesquieu. He whispered that maybe, just maybe, power should be divided, that absolutism was not the natural order of things, that even a king could be wrong. These were not just dusty words, they were flares in the night. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, those ideas were catching fire. In 1776, American colonists declared independence from Britain, citing many of the very French thinkers who now watched with fascination and jealousy. Because back in France, things were uneasy. Louis XV had inherited the throne from the Sun King's long reign, but not his brilliance. He was called well-beloved early on, but by the end of his life, that love had turned to disdain. His court was decadent, his advisors corrupt, the country's finances in shambles, and his grandson, Louis XVI, was handed a kingdom with more debt than direction. Louis XVI was young, earnest, and not entirely prepared. He liked locks and clocks, things that could be wound up and fixed. But France was not so simple. The peasants were hungry. Bread prices soared. The tax system was a mess. Nobles and clergy paid almost nothing, while commoners bore the weight. And in Versailles, the court danced on. Then came Marie Antoinette. She was Austrian, elegant, and tragically misunderstood. Let them eat cake. People claimed she said, though she probably never did. Still, the damage was done. She became a symbol of everything the people hated: opulence, distance, indifference. By the late 1780s, the murmurs had become roars. Pamphlets flooded the streets. Plays mocked the king. Cartoons showed nobles gorging while peasants starved. Even the weather joined the protest. Harvests failed. Rivers froze, and stomachs growled. Louis, desperate, called for a meeting of the Estates General, the first in over 170 years. It was meant to be a formality, but it became a spark. The Third Estate, the commoners, walked out, declared themselves the true voice of the people, swore the tennis court oath, promised not to disband until France had a constitution, and the king. He hesitated, wavered, then, too late, tried to suppress it. In July of 1789, the people of Paris stormed the Bastille, a medieval prison that held barely any prisoners, but symbolized centuries of royal tyranny. They tore it down brick by brick like they were dismantling the very idea of monarchy. And in that moment, France changed. Forever. The Enlightenment had planted the seeds. Hunger had watered them. And now they were blooming with rage, with hope, with the promise of something new. The students in that cafe didn't know it, but they were the echoes of that moment. Still arguing, still dreaming, still believing that words could shape the world. And maybe they still can. Liberty, Fraternity, and the Guillotine, the French Revolution. There is a particular silence that follows when a nation realizes it has killed its king. Not the silence of peace, but of a breath held too long, unsure whether to weep or cheer. France entered that silence in 1793, and it would not exhale for years. The revolution had begun with songs and slogans: Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. But those three words would soon be soaked in blood. After the storming of the Bastille, everything moved fast. Feudal privileges were abolished. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was adopted, echoing Enlightenment ideals and the American example. Suddenly, the people were no longer subjects. They were citizens. The king, meanwhile, tried to play along. Louis XVI wore the revolutionary cockade, addressed the National Assembly, smiled for the crowd. But behind the scenes, he was writing to foreign monarchs, asking for help. When he and Marie Antoinette tried to flee the country in 1791, dressed as commoners, They were caught in Varennes. It was the point of no return. To many, he was no longer a ruler. He was a traitor. By 1792, the monarchy was abolished. The First French Republic was declared. Louis was put on trial, found guilty of conspiracy against the liberty of the nation, and sentenced to death. He was guillotined on a cold January morning in 1793. Marie followed later that year, and then came the Terror. With the monarchy gone, power did not settle, it splintered. Factions emerged, Girondins, Jacobins, Montagnards. Speeches turned to accusations. Accusations turned to executions. Led by men like Robespierre and Danton, the Committee of Public Safety took control, determined to purge France of enemies, both foreign and domestic. The guillotine became a daily ritual. Crowds gathered as if for theater. Heads rolled, noble priests, journalists, even former revolutionaries, who now seemed too moderate. Fear hung in the air like smoke. Robespierre believed in virtue, and he believed terror was its instrument. The republic, he said, must be defended by virtue and terror. But when he finally named himself as the sole voice of the revolution, the people turned. In July 1794, he too was sent to the guillotine, jaw-shattered, eyes wide in the very square where so many others had fallen. The terror ended, but France was exhausted. What followed was a period of uncertainty, the Directory. 5 men ruled supposedly as a balance of power. But corruption ran deep. The economy limped. Foreign wars dragged on. The ideals of the revolution remained etched into law and memory, but their purity had been tested. And through it all, one figure began to rise. A Corsican artillery officer, ambitious, brilliant, tireless. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. While Paris was tearing itself apart, Napoleon had been winning battles in Italy and Egypt. He spoke the language of the revolution but dreamed in empires. In 1799, he returned to France, staged a coup, and took power as first consul. The Republic technically survived, but it was now in the hands of one man. Some called it betrayal. Others called it salvation. Because after a decade of chaos, blood, and broken promises, the French were tired of liberty, with no bread equality, with no justice fraternity, with no peace. They were ready for order, for glory, for a new chapter, and Napoleon was ready to write it. The rise and reign of Napoleon Empire in a tricorn hat. I once stood at Les Invalides, where Napoleon lies beneath layers of marble and pride, and I remember thinking, how could one man be so many things? A revolutionary and an emperor, a savior and a tyrant, a man who rose from almost nothing only to crown himself everything. When Napoleon Bonaparte took power in 1799, France was weary. The revolution had given birth to ideals but also chaos. People were hungry for stability, and Napoleon offered just that, wrapped in military glory, wrapped in order, wrapped in a uniform tailored for destiny. He began as first consul. But in 1804, inside Notre Dame Cathedral, he took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. That gesture said everything. France had a new emperor, and he had no intention of bowing to anyone. But this was not a return to the old monarchy. Napoleon was no Louis. He rewrote laws, codified rights, reorganized schools. The Napoleonic Code, still studied today, replaced patchwork feudal rules with one consistent system of justice. It enshrined civil liberties, property rights, and merit-based advancement. For many, especially outside the nobility, it was the revolution's promise finally kept. Still, freedom has its limits when carved by a sword. Napoleon wanted more than France. He wanted Europe. From 1803 onward, he waged war after war, defeating Austrians, Prussians, and Russians. He reshaped the map, created satellite kingdoms, installed his brothers as kings, exported the Napoleonic Code like a missionary in boots. Wherever his armies marched, change followed. So did conscription. So did taxes. And yet in the beginning, many welcomed him. He promised order. He brought modernity. He inspired awe. Even his enemies could not help but admire his speed, his genius, his strange mixture of cold calculation and roaring ambition. But power breeds enemies. Britain never fully conquered, funded coalition after coalition against him. Spain, once an ally, turned into a quagmire of guerrilla warfare. Russia was the beginning of the end. In 1812, Napoleon invaded. He led over 600,000 men into the vast, unforgiving land. But the Russians did not fight to win battles. They fought to destroy supplies, to lure Napoleon deeper. The French reached Moscow, only to find it burning. No shelter, no victory. And then came the winter. It was not war that killed his army. It was cold, hunger, disease, and retreat. Fewer than 100,000 returned, some say even fewer. Back in Europe, the myth was cracking. By 1814, the Allies marched into Paris. Napoleon abdicated. He was exiled to Elba, a tiny island that could barely contain his ego. France restored the Bourbon monarchy. But history loves a twist. In 1815, Napoleon escaped Elba, returned to France. And in a span of weeks, the people, soldiers, townsfolk, even his former enemies rallied to him. No gun fired against him. He took back power, and for 100 days, France held its breath. Then came Waterloo. It was a muddy Belgian field. Rain soaked the cannons. British and Prussian forces, led by Wellington and Blucher, stood firm. Napoleon's magic was gone, his tactics predictable, his forces stretched too thin. The dream ended in mud and smoke. He was captured again. This time they sent him far St. Helena, a desolate rock in the South Atlantic. There, surrounded by mist and memory, he dictated his story, tried to shape his legacy. He died in 1821, possibly of cancer, possibly of poison, depending on which version you believe. But France had changed. It had seen a king fall, a republic rise, an emperor dominate and then collapse. It had ridden the storm of revolution and the march of ambition. And now, it stood at a crossroads. The world remembered Napoleon as many things. But in France, he was always more than a man. He was a mirror of its hopes, its pride, its contradictions. And he still is. Restoration and resistance. France in a post-Napoleon world. After Waterloo, it felt like someone had slammed the door shut on a wild, roaring party, and then tried to pretend it had never happened. The kings came back. The nobles returned, and the whole country tried to smooth out its crumpled suit and act respectable again. But the echoes of revolution and empire do not fade that easily. The Bourbon monarchy was restored in 1814 with Louis XVI, the brother of the executed king. He returned not as an absolute monarch, but as a constitutional ruler, forced to navigate the wreckage of a society that had tasted liberty, chaos, and glory, all in the span of a few decades. Louis tried to keep things balanced. He retained the Napoleonic Code. He kept civil rights. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Royalists wanted revenge. Liberals wanted more reform. And the people were tired, confused, and not entirely sure which France they now belonged to. When Louis XVI died in 1824, his brother Charles VI took the throne, and the pendulum swung sharply to the right. Charles was no moderate. He believed in divine right aristocratic privilege and the good old days. He tried to compensate émigrés nobles, gave more power to the church, and dissolved the elected Chamber of Deputies when it pushed back. In 1830, after trying to muzzle the press and limit voting rights even further, Charles sparked the July Revolution. Paris, ever the stage for French transformation, erupted again. Barricades rose, shots rang out. The tricolor flag flew once more. Charles fled. And in his place, a new kind of king emerged, Louis-Philippe, the citizen king. He dressed in a suit, not robes. He claimed to rule by the will of the people. But even he could not escape the trap of trying to please both revolutionaries and royalists. He expanded voting rights, but only to the wealthy. He walked a careful line, sometimes progressive, sometimes repressive. Times. Under Louis-Philippe, France industrialized. Railroads appeared. Factories grew. A new bourgeoisie, wealthy but not noble, rose in influence. But so did inequality. So did unrest. And then came 1848. That year, revolutions swept across Europe like a sudden storm. In Paris, once again, the people took to the streets. The monarchy fell again. Louis-Philippe abdicated and fled to England, and France became a republic again. The Second Republic this time. It was short-lived. Amid economic troubles, political squabbles, and fears of socialism, the people elected a new president, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of Napoleon himself. He had the name, the charm, and the promise of order. In 1851, he seized power in a coup. In 1852, he crowned himself Emperor Napoleon III. History, it seemed, had a sense of humor, but Napoleon III was no mere imitation. He modernized Paris, widened boulevards, built parks, improved sanitation. He expanded the railways, boosted industry, and dreamed of building a modern French empire abroad. For a time, he succeeded. Yet beneath the gleaming streets of Haussmann's Paris, the cracks remained. Opposition simmered, censorship returned, wars loomed, and as always, France stood once again on the edge of change. Because in the wings, waiting quietly, was a rising power in the East Prussia, and the next fall would not come from within. It would come from war, blood and iron, war with Prussia and the fall of the empire. I remember walking past a statue in Paris, once Napoleon III on horseback, cast in bronze like a man carved from certainty. But certainty is a tricky thing in France. One moment it's dressed in velvet, the next it's fleeing the city in a train car. By the late 1860s, Napoleon III was losing his shine. His early years had been full of triumph, modern cities, colonial expansion, industrial growth. But his later years, less so. He backed a disastrous expedition in Mexico that ended with an emperor shot by firing squad. He restricted press freedom, faced economic downturns, and critics whispered louder each year. And then came Prussia. In 1870, a diplomatic spat over the Spanish throne turned into something far more dangerous. The Prussians, led by Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, were eager for a fight. Bismarck edited a telegram, yes, a telegram, to make it sound like the French had been insulted. France, never one to ignore an insult, declared war. It was exactly what Bismarck wanted. What followed was the Franco-Prussian War, a swift and brutal humiliation. France was unprepared. Prussia was ready. French armies stumbled through logistics miscommunication and outdated tactics. Within weeks, Napoleon III himself was captured at Sedan, his army crushed. He was sent into exile. Just like that, the empire collapsed. But the worst wasn't over. With the emperor gone, the Third Republic was proclaimed in Paris. But the Prussians weren't finished. They besieged the city, For 4 months, Paris starved. Horses disappeared from the streets. Dogs and cats vanished. Even the zoo's animals were eaten. Cold, hungry, and surrounded Parisians held on, but eventually they surrendered in January 1871. Peace came with a price. France ceded Alsace and Lorraine, two eastern provinces with rich soil, proud culture, and deep symbolic value. The wound ran deep, but then, as France tried to recover, Paris exploded again. In March 1871, a radical socialist government known as the Paris Commune seized control of the capital. It was an experiment in workers' rule in radical democracy, in revenge against those who had failed the people. For 2 months, they governed abolishing conscription, separating church and state, experimenting with women's rights and workers' protections. But the national government, now based in Versailles, struck back. What followed was the Semaine Sanglante, the Bloody Week. The army retook Paris in a storm of gunfire. Thousands died in the streets. Executions happened by the wall in Père Lachaise cemetery. The Commune was crushed. Its memory, though, endured in murals, in songs, in dreams. And France was exhausted. But it had a republic again. And this time, it stuck. The Third Republic would last through scandals, strikes, and sorrow for nearly 70 years. It was not always elegant and rarely peaceful, but it endured. It built schools. It raised monuments. It dug deep roots in a country that seemed addicted to revolution. And as the 19th century faded into the 20th, France stood at a strange crossroad, no longer an empire, not quite stable, but still standing, still French, still defiant. But just over the horizon, the drums of another storm began to beat. The world would soon go to war, and France would again be at its heart, trenches and trials. France in the First World War. If you ever walked through the fields of northern France, you might notice how quiet they seem. Just wind in the grass, maybe the hum of a distant tractor. But if you listen a little deeper, if you let your imagination sit with the silence, you can almost hear it. The thunder of shells, the whistle of gas, the cries from a trench. That land remembers. In 1914, the world stumbled into the Great War, and France was among the first to bleed. The causes were tangled, of course, alliances, old rivalries, a spark in Sarajevo, but once Austria declared war on Serbia, the dominoes fell fast. France, bound by treaty to Russia, found itself staring down Germany once more. This time, Germany struck first. Their armies surged through Belgium, hoping to outflank French defenses. In response, France launched its own offensive into Alsace, and Lorraine, still smarting from their loss in 1871. But the attacks failed. By autumn, the war had settled into something no one expected: trench warfare. From the North Sea to Switzerland, soldiers dug in. Mud rats, cold and endless artillery turned the land into a nightmare. French troops, poilus, as they were called, held the line through some of the worst fighting in modern history. None more famous or more horrific than Verdun. In 1916, the Germans launched a massive assault on the fortress city, hoping to bleed France white. For 10 months, French and German troops hurled shells, bullets, and bodies at each other. Over 700,000 casualties. The land around Verdun still bears the scars: craters, bone fragments, rusted helmets. And yet France did not fall. They held. Meanwhile, back home, the war reshaped life. Women took on roles in factories and farms. Cities rationed food. Children collected scrap metal. The entire country became part of the war machine. In 1917, hope flickered. The United States entered the war bringing fresh troops and energy. By 1918, with German morale sinking and revolution brewing in their own streets, the tide finally turned. France advanced. Germany fell back. And on November 11, 1918, at 11:00 a.m., the guns finally fell silent. France had survived, but at a terrible cost. 1.4 million French soldiers dead, millions more wounded, entire villages wiped from the map, landscapes so shattered they were declared Zone Rouge uninhabitable forever. The victory was real, but it was heavy. In the aftermath, France helped shape the Treaty of Versailles, demanding harsh penalties for Germany reparations, disarmament, the return of Alsace and Lorraine. Some hoped it would ensure peace. But peace built on bitterness is rarely stable. The 1920s brought a strange mix of grief and glamour. Paris became a hub for artists, writers, and jazz. The années folles, the crazy years, spun through cafes and salons, but beneath the surface wounds still ached. And when the Great Depression rolled in by the 1930s, those wounds began to reopen, because storm clouds were gathering again, and France, weary and wary, would once more be tested. Occupied and divided France in the Second World War. When I think of France in the 1940s, I do not think of maps or speeches or generals first. I think of a bicycle, an old one, with a baguette tied to the back and a note hidden beneath the seat. I think of quiet acts of defiance of eyes that met across crowded train cars and said everything without a word. That, too, was war. It began again in 1939. Germany invaded Poland, and France, bound by treaty, declared war. But months passed in strange silence, the phony war, they called it. People waited. And then, in May 1940, Germany struck. Fast, ruthless, different. Instead of digging into trenches like before, Hitler's tanks rolled through the Ardennes, bypassing the Maginot Line, that great wall of French defense. In weeks, Paris fell. The government fled south. By June, France had surrendered. The country was split. The north was occupied by Nazi Germany. The swastika flew over the Eiffel Tower. German troops marched down the Champs-Élysées. Curfews, checkpoints, fear. And in the south, a so-called free zone was governed from the town of Vichy under Marshal Philippe Pétain, a hero of Verdun, now leading a collaborationist regime. Some supported him. Many didn't. Others refused to bow. The French resistance began not as an army but as a whisper, a pamphlet here, a stolen radio broadcast there, teenagers on bicycles, grandmothers passing messages, teachers hiding children. It was not uniform, it was not always clean, but it grew. And across the sea, a man named Charles de Gaulle, a French general, refused to accept surrender. From London, he called on his countrymen to resist. He became the voice of Free France. Meanwhile, the war raged on. French Jews were rounded up. Val d'Hiv, the winter velodrome in Paris, became a holding pen before deportation to camps. Over 75,000 Jews from France were sent to their deaths. Some were betrayed. Many were saved by neighbors, by strangers, by sheer luck. In 1944, hope returned. D-Day, June 6th. Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. French units fought among them. The liberation had begun. Town by town, city by city, the Germans were pushed back. The resistance rose up to help. In August, Paris itself revolted, and by the end of that month, the city was free. De Gaulle marched down the Champs-Élysées, not as a conqueror, but as a returned son. But freedom brought reckoning. Collaborators were punished. Women accused of sleeping with German soldiers had their heads shaved in public. Some were jailed. Others simply disappeared. The country was wounded, proud, uncertain. And yet, it stood. In 1946, France declared a new republic, its fourth. But the scars of war and the challenges of peace were not easily left behind. The world was changing, and France again would have to find its place within it. Empire, unraveled republic, reborn France. After the war, after the parades ended and the flags were folded away, France faced a different kind of struggle, not one of tanks and trenches, but of identity, of empire, of memory. The war was over, but the world it left behind was brittle. France emerged in 1945, both proud and broken. Cities lay in ruins, infrastructure crippled, the economy gasping, and yet there was resolve, a hunger to rebuild. The Fourth Republic was declared in 1946, and the country set about patching itself together. There were plans, elections, debates. But beneath it all, the foundation was shifting, because France was still an empire. Its colonies stretched from Africa to Asia, and for years they had been told they were part of France, that they fought with her, not for her. But now those promises were being tested, and many had grown tired of waiting. In Indochina, that discontent flared first. A young leader named Ho Chi Minh, who had once admired the ideals of the French Republic, now led a fight for independence. The war that followed was brutal. Jungle warfare, ambushes, political missteps. And in 1954, after the devastating defeat at Dien Bien Phu, France was forced to withdraw. It was a wound to pride, and it would not be the last. In Algeria, the conflict cut deeper. Algeria was not seen as a colony. It was considered part of France. But for many Algerians, equality had never come. The war began in 1954 and dragged on for 8 bloody years. It was not just a war of soldiers, but of civilians, of bombings in cafes, torture in prisons, neighbors divided. Back in France, the war tore at politics. Protests erupted, governments fell, and by 1958, the Fourth Republic collapsed under the weight of its own indecision. Into that vacuum stepped an old voice, Charles de Gaulle. He returned with a calm authority, promising stability. A new constitution was drafted and the Fifth Republic was born, one with a strong presidency, one meant to weather storms. And yet even under de Gaulle, change was not easy. In 1962, Algeria finally gained independence. Over 1 million pieds noirs Europeans born in Algeria fled to France. The country welcomed them, but tensions simmered. And so did questions. What was France now? A European power? A post-imperial state? A land of liberty, or one still wrestling with its past? Then came 1968. You may remember. Or maybe you watched it unfold on your parents' television, black and white, but full of fire. Students took to the streets. Workers joined them. Paris was paralyzed by strikes. They wanted education, reform workers' rights, a new voice for a new generation. It was a moment of chaos, but also of awakening. France came through it changed. The old ways were questioned. New voices rose, women, immigrants, young activists. And though de Gaulle resigned in 1969, the Republic endured. By the 1970s and 1980s, France had stepped fully into the modern world. High-speed trains, nuclear energy, a place in the European community, the early shape of today's European Union. Culture flourished, cinema, cuisine, fashion. The old was honored, but the new was embraced. And yet beneath it all, France never stopped looking inward, wrestling with its past, with Vichy, with Algeria, with empire, with identity. Because being French, like being human, is a constant act of remembering, of choosing what to carry forward and what to lay down. And as the 20th century faded into the 21st, France stood once again at a crossroads, still proud, still questioning, Still France, a memory, a mirror, and a soft good night. You've come with me all this way, and I'm grateful, not just because you listened, but because you felt it. The dust of Roman roads, the chill of revolution, the hush of Paris at dawn, after the tanks rolled out. That's the gift of history. It does not just tell us what happened, it reminds us that people lived it. And France lived fully. From the Gauls along the riverbank to the murmurs of revolution in the Salons. From cathedrals that took centuries to rise to moments of resistance that bloomed in a single breath. From kings who ruled with jewels to students who threw stones for change. It has been a country of contradictions, grace and grit, beauty and fire. Somewhere in that long line of centuries, we caught glimpses of ourselves. In the love of liberty, in the fight for identity, in the stubborn refusal to be defined by defeat. You may not remember every date, every name, every shift of crown or border, but maybe you'll remember the feeling that France, with all her elegance and unrest, still found a way to keep going, to rebuild, to imagine, to care. So now as you lie back and let the night settle in, I just want to thank you for traveling back through time with me, for being the kind of person who still listens to stories, the kind who still wonders. We'll visit another place next time, but for tonight, let the Eiffel Tower flicker behind your eyelids. Let the River Seine carry you gently, and sleep, knowing that even in the mess of history, there are moments of light. Thank you for listening. Good night.